Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. In case you're not already familiar with us, the Helsinki Commission is a bipartisan, bicameral commission mandated to monitor compliance with the Helsinki Accords and advance comprehensive security in the 57-nation OSCE region. Today's event is on contesting Russia, lessons from Central and Eastern Europe. Before introducing our panelists, I'll give a few short words about our discussion today. Russian aggression has long been a defining force in Europe's security landscape, from Imperial Russia to Soviet Russia to now under Putin's Russia. The nations of the Visegrad Four and the Baltics have been on the front lines of this imperialism, enduring decades of oppression and control. Their proximity to Russia, combined with their lived experiences behind the Iron Curtain, gives these countries an unparalleled perspective on the enduring Russian threat, a perspective that is invaluable to Europe's security and the broader international community. Today, the V4 and Baltic states are frequent targets of Moscow's hybrid warfare, including attacks on critical infrastructure, disinformation, election interference, airspace violations, cyber warfare, and the list goes on, all aimed at destabilizing their governments. As an early warning system for the rest of Europe, these nations have consistently sounded the alarm about the dangers Russia poses to European security. With Russia continuing its genocidal war in Ukraine and engaging in hybrid warfare directly on NATO soil, the lessons learned from this region are critical for strengthening our collective defense. Building on the Helsinki Commission staff report, Contesting Russia, Preparing for the Long-Term Russian Threat, today's briefing will explore Russia's persistent aggression in the region and examine how the V4 and Baltic states have responded. I'm also interested in getting our panelists' perspectives on how the United States can deepen its support for these frontline states, strengthen regional security, and counter Russian influence over the long term. We are fortunate to have with us three distinguished experts who will share their insights. First, we'll hear from Dalibor Rohac, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Next, Indra Ekmanis, Baltic Sea Fellow for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Finally, Andrew Mikta, Director and Senior Fellow of the Scowcroft Geostrategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and I'm looking forward to an insightful discussion. With that, let's begin with Dalibor.
Jordan, thank you, and thank you all for coming today and for bearing with me for a few minutes. I think there is a degree of significance to the day on which we are meeting here in the Cannon Building. On the 23rd of October 1956, a group of Hungarian students in Budapest called on the general public to join their protests. And what ensued was one of the most impressive, largest act of defiance against the Soviet domination of the Eastern Bloc. It ended in a bloodbath, 2,500 Hungarians killed, 250,000 Hungarians who emigrated. As Russia is casting its shadow over Eastern Europe, interfering with elections in places such as Moldova and Georgia this coming weekend, I think there is some value in reflecting on how little and has changed in those 70 years. I should preface this by saying that I had the opportunity to spend a few days in various European capitals last week, talking to a number of European policymakers, including in Brussels. And my basic message for fellow Americans and also for the Western Europeans I've encountered is very simple, that we are not alarmed enough. And I don't think we are listening enough to those who know more about the Russian threat than we do. Three very simple observations. In Ukraine, Russia is making slow but steady and sustainable progress in the Donbass. As one official I saw put it, these small tactical victories that we talk about may very well add up to a significant strategic advantage unless they are countered more effectively. We are also in a situation in which Russia is waging the war using North Korean troops, Iranian drones. This might be the closest, certainly in my lifetime, that we've come to a global war. Speak to friends in the Baltic states, Latvians, Lithuanians. They have dragon teeth on their border crossings with Russia. They have mined some of these roads to Russia. And in the West, I think we are summarily ignoring the main lesson from the most recent global war that ended in 1945, namely that aggression by revisionists needs to be nipped in the bud. And today, much more so than in the early months of the war, there is growing demand for accommodating Russia in ways that will only entice Putin to test our resolve further. I mean, as North Korean generals and officers are taking selfies on the Red Square, you see the UN Secretary General hang out with Vladimir Putin and the other BRICS leaders. The other observation that I have to make, based on some of these conversations I had last week, is that allied militaries, and Andrew will probably expand on that a little bit, are seriously under-resourced. Despite Zeitenwende, despite the increase in defense budgets, relative to the needs of what might be looming as a global conflict, we are woefully ill-prepared. I mean, I would urge everybody to ask the local NATO official whether they think that the alliance's operational plans can be executed, given the state of our militaries and our defense budgets. Now, things did not have to turn this way. It was very clear back in 2007, after Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, that he already saw the West as an adversary, that he had a very dismissive view of the sovereignty and self-determination of countries of Central and Eastern Europe. He saw NATO enlargements as a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and he saw it as directed against him. And the question is, if this was his reading of the situation, what were we expecting him to do? I mean, clearly, there were those in Eastern Europe who understood the message very clearly. Back then, 2009, famous open letter to the Obama administration from a group of Central Eastern European leaders, senior statesmen and diplomats, including Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, Emil Constantinescu of Romania, Vaira Vike-Freiberga of Latvia, warned Americans that we are dealing with a revisionist power pursuing 19th century agenda with 21st century tactics. They were brushed away as hysterics, yet this was already after the 2008 attack on Georgia. There was this notion prevailing in the West for a very long time that Russia, despite all this, can be engaged and made a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And this sort of haughty, dismissive attitude towards those in Central and Eastern Europe who sort of knew better continued well into the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine got, the infamy of the Minsk Accords, basically setting the stage for further aggression, instead of rectifying the original sin of the Budapest Memorandum. There is more than just a hint of a drift to push Ukraine to negotiations without first establishing a favorable balance of power on the battlefield. I think it's hugely dangerous. It's another iteration of the same mistake done before. And it's not just a problem of the Trump-Vance campaign. I mean, it is also the attitude of a large chunk of Europe's political class. I wouldn't be surprised that if the former President Trump is elected and if he forces some sort of settlement on Ukraine, we will see much of Western Europe to be happy to go along. And we can also expand on the half-hearted approach of the Biden administration, the sluggishness, the almost homeopathic drip of aid throughout these past 2.5 years that has contributed to the problem. My message, I don't want to go on for any longer. My message is very simple. We are running out of time to establish deterrence and to prevent Europe's descent into a conflict that will be much worse than the one we are looking at in in Ukraine. And so I would urge everybody to act with urgency that this moment needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalibor, for that message. Indra.
Well, thank you, Jordan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, while they are comparatively small countries with a combined population of just 6 million people, make up this key region bridging the West and Russia, right? Among their strongest unifying factors are their experiences under 5 decades of repressive Soviet occupation, their post-Soviet reversion to liberal democracies, accession to critical international institutions, the EU and NATO, their responses to revanchist Russia on their borders, and currently their leadership and ironclad military, humanitarian, and political support for Ukraine in its war against Russian aggression. In the Baltic states, Russian aggression has effectively operated in the gray zone, skirting the edges of what might trigger NATO's Article 5 and taking the form of cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, military provocations, exertions of political and economic pressure on the countries. The Baltic states, in turn, have responded by turning areas of risk into areas of expertise. For example, by establishing the NATO Centers of Excellence for Cyber Defense in Estonia, which weathered the world's first large-scale cyber attack coming from Russia on government and society in 2007, on energy security in Lithuania, where previous dependency on Russia left the country vulnerable to energy blackmail, and on strategic communications in Latvia, where ethno-linguistic divisions have exposed the population to Russian disinformation assaults. And while there's much room to strengthen these efforts and to do so in partnership with the US and other allies, the Baltic perspective offers key lessons for countering Russia today. First is our understanding of NATO as an effective bulwark against Russia. While initially largely recipients of NATO's collective defense, the Baltic countries have emerged as leaders in the alliance and are taking an active role in strengthening deterrence on their eastern flank through their own defensive posture. Since 2014, the Baltic states have accelerated their defense spending. Their 2025 budgets, all 3 of them, foresee more than 3% of GDP on defense, and they are actively encouraging their NATO partners to join them. They have undertaken multiple military procurement projects, including deep strike capabilities that would put St. Petersburg within range of guided missiles from Estonia, and building the land-based counter-mobility area, which Dalibor mentioned, the Baltic Defense Line, to slow potential incursion of enemy forces. Active lobbying from the countries has also helped to increase, though there's always room for more, a NATO allies' presence in the region, including work to upgrade their enhanced forward presence battalions to brigades on either permanent, persistently deployed, or high readiness bases. Continued defense cooperation, including with the US, including through the funding for the Baltic Security Initiative, is also a critical component of these deterrence efforts. As direct targets of Russia's hybrid warfare, the Baltic countries have adopted defense models that include not only developing military capabilities, but also a whole of government and whole of society approach. This includes establishing public-private cooperation, introducing national defense curriculum, enabling population readiness, bolstering psychological defenses, and securing strategic communications and economic and energy resilience. Some tangible examples of this include cybersecurity education, civil defense drills, the expansion of the national service, recently in Latvia, and forward-thinking energy infrastructure development, enabling diversification and a pivot away from reliance on Russia. This whole-of-society approach is possible because of the Baltic states' successful post-Soviet transition, including integration with the European Union and NATO since 2004. They have developed a strong rule of law, ranking highly in global indices and on some indicators outperforming the US, which has been a remarkable, rapid, and stable transition, and today the Baltic states stand out for their progressive political systems in comparison to much of the rest of Europe, where fringe parties are gaining traction. Similarly, the Baltic states support a robust civil society, seen, for example, in the local response to supporting Ukrainian refugees. Part and parcel of this is their work to counter disinformation and better integrate society. In Estonia and Latvia, ethno-linguistic cleavages have been key leverage points for Russia, which exploits their so-called compatriots and seeks to paint the Baltic states as failing democracies. This narrative is subverted not only through media literacy education, debunking efforts, achievements in social integration, but also through lived experiences. When Russian-speaking populations, diverse in their own right, can contrast the quality of life, opportunity, freedom, and peace in the Baltic states with the realities of Russians just across the border, the impact of these narratives becomes blunted, which is a takeaway here for Americans, perhaps, while improving the social and economic safety net helps mitigate existing divisions in society and builds a population that is less vulnerable to exploitation by Russian information manipulation. A strong democratic, engaged civil society and a high quality of life are also critical components to countering Russia. When the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, there were some who argued that the expansion of the military alliance was provoking the Russian bear. These arguments again resurfaced after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I think this is a concerning, if perhaps also instructive narrative, not only because the argument prioritizes the comfort of the aggressor and diminishes the agency and self-determination of the sovereign states, but also because the argument has already been in some ways proven wrong, with Ukraine as the devastating counterfactual. The Baltic states know from their own experience that a strong and resilient NATO, one that offers maximum support to and eventually includes Ukraine, is critical to countering Russia. Perhaps the fundamental lesson from the Baltic experience, which has gone unheeded for too long, is a clear-eyed understanding of today's Russia and the worldview in which it is steeped. Russia's perception of international affairs relies on opposition, on Russia versus the West. Soft power has not been an effective deterrent. Interdependence heightens rather than mitigates risk, and appeasement does not and will not bring peace, rather it emboldens aggressors and results in oppression and future conflict. The Baltic countries have long been testing grounds for the hybrid tactics Russia has gone on to use elsewhere, including in Georgia, Ukraine, and also the US. Now it is imperative that Baltic warnings continue to resonate not as paranoia from traumatized states, but rather as key insight into the nature of an aggressive neighbor with expansive imperial ambitions predicated on manipulating government and society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indra. Andrew.
Yes, thank you. Please allow me to enter these initial comments into the record, and I want to underscore, now you can hear me, and I want to underscore that the principal problem we're facing is that we consistently misunderstand what Russia is and what drives its behavior in the both in the region and globally. So let me put it up front, and Dalibor already highlighted that. Russia is a quintessentially revisionist state. It is aligned today with three other powers: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. I call those four the axis of dictatorships. We could debate whether or not there are things bringing them together other than the opposition and the intention on overthrowing the international system put in place by the United States and its democratic allies after the Cold War. I would submit to you that for over 2 decades now, Russia has been relitigating the post-Cold War settlement, driven by its determination to restore the inner core of its former empire and to establish a sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. The war in Ukraine is not a sui generis event. It is a manifestation of Vladimir Putin's drive to restore Veliki Ruski Mir, Pax Russica, to put it differently, that is rooted in the fundamentals of Russian thinking about geopolitics and strategy that informed formative experience as an empire. This strategic culture sees the empire as rooted in the Eastern Slavic core of 3 nations: the Great Russians, as they call themselves, the Little Russians, as they refer to the Ukrainians sometimes, or Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. Russian imperialism perceives itself to be in fundamental civilizational opposition to the West, the roots of which go back to the 19th century and the introduction of the official national policy that rested on 3 principles at that time: the Orthodox faith, autocracy, and what they called nationality, narodnost, whereby nationality meant walling off the empire from the West and fighting foreign influences alien to Russia and the Russian national ideal. The triad that came to be known as the official nationalism in the 19th century became the dominant ideological doctrine of the Russian Empire, and it generated a policy of Russification in the 19th century of all non-Russian imperial lands. I bring this bit of history up here to make the following point. Today, in my view, there are persistent echoes of this ideology and Putin's insistence that, quote, there is no such thing as a Ukrainian nation, unquote, and his focus on Eurasianism as a pathway to de-Westernize Russia. Moscow's overarching objective is to reconquer its near abroad by relying on military power to score geopolitical wins and restore itself as a great power in other theaters as well. This process began in 2008 with the Russian invasion of Georgia, in the aftermath of which Moscow severed two provinces, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It continued with the 2014 seizure and incorporation of Crimea, Moscow's entry into Syria in 2015, and most recently with the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I want to underscore that even before Russia launched its military conquest, it had already been shaping the battlefield, so to speak, through information operations, cyber attacks, espionage, and attempts at elite bribery and corruption, with the objective of achieving partial elite capture across the region. As I have written elsewhere, Russia is already in what I call phase 0 of a protracted conflict with the West, targeting Eastern and Central Europe and the Baltic states as its near-term strategic objectives, and planning a long game to force the United States and its European allies to accept Russia's status as a major power in Europe, entitled to an exclusive sphere of domination in Eastern Europe and a sphere of privileged interest in Central Europe, including in the countries that are members of NATO and the European Union today. At a risk of over-rationalizing history, I submit that there are striking parallels between the trajectory followed by Germany after its defeat in World War I and the road Russia has traveled since the end of the Cold War. In both cases, the dominant narrative produced for domestic consumption during the Weimar Republic in Germany and the Yeltsin decade in Russia was one of betrayal rather than defeat. In Germany, the so-called Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, claimed that Germany was never defeated, but rather was betrayed. In Russia, Putin has offered the population a similar narrative, blaming the West for the alleged treachery that brought down the Soviet Union. I bring this up because that imperial narrative, much as it led to the rise of Hitler in Germany, continues to sustain Putin's revisionism in Central and Eastern Europe. According to this view, the great Russian nation was robbed of its greatness by the United States and by the West. And hence, any action to remedy this perceived injustice is justified in the eyes of Russian imperialists. Hence, I would submit the threat Russia poses to Central and Eastern Europe and to peace and stability worldwide more broadly will not abate as long as the Russian revisionist narrative holds. Till then, Russia will remain a chronic threat to the United States and to its allies. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for these really insightful and powerful statements. So we'll open it up shortly to question and answer questions from the audience. So please think a little bit about what you may want to ask our experts here. But I'll start with a question of my own, which is on hybrid warfare. The Helsinki Commission recently had a hearing on what we called Russia's shadow war, where we explored the impact of Russian hybrid warfare on NATO countries. And it's clear that the Visegrad 4 and Baltic states are some of the hardest hit by these operations. Could you share a specific example of Russian hybrid warfare in your region of work, whether it's disinformation, cyber attacks, infrastructure attacks, or other forms that you've been examining or you think is particularly important to highlight? Sure.
Thank you, Jordan. Happy to make an initial stab at answering that. I should probably preface that by saying that I was struck by, in a conversation recently with Edward Lucas, the long-term Eastern European editor of The Economist, by his insight that to talk about the hybrid warfare or gray zone warfare kind of diminishes the size of the threat in popular imagination. Most people just tune it out. It seems like it's not a significant enough subject. Russians themselves call these operations active measures. I think maybe that's something that sort of might have more resonance. And the reality of it is that some of this stuff is really dangerous. I mean, sending intelligence officers to assassinate people in Salisbury or blowing up munition depots in NATO member states. I mean, it's not just a sort of innocuous thing. It's not. I don't think the term hybrid operation or gray zone warfare sort of does it justice. So there are plenty of examples across Central and Eastern Europe and indeed across the Western world that we could draw on from. So some of the well-documented the Czech and British examples, but also last year in France, in the immediate aftermath of October 7 attack in Israel, clearly the Russians were very keen to sort of insert themselves into what was a sort of controversial and tense moment in French politics. So, Stars of David were being painted by Russian undercover agents in Muslim-majority neighborhoods. More recently, Holocaust Memorial in Paris was defaced again by people who were being paid by the Russians. I mean, wherever there is an opening for sort of sowing discord, Russians seize it. So that goes on top of actually blowing up stuff and poisoning people. But the most grotesque example, I think, from the very recent, most immediate past, is the Moldovan referendum and the first round of the presidential election this past weekend. So, country of 2 million people, Russia spends 100 million euros on buying votes. Moldovan officials say that it resulted in a sort of switch of around 300,000 votes in an election in a very small country. I mean, in September alone, Moldovan authorities intercepted 15 million euros going to bank accounts of 130,000 Moldovan citizens. And there's ample anecdotal evidence from this weekend of people sort of going to the polls asking for money or expecting money or, who knows what they were promised. It's been done in a very brazen way. And the main reason I bring it up is that I'm not aware of any response that could establish deterrence by punishment in response to this act. Maybe we'll sort of talk about it more in the next round of questioning, but it is critical to me that we think in the West about a sort of escalatory ladder that can deter all these measures that are sort of short of kinetic war, because we've done a really miserable job at it.
Thanks. Would either you like to add? Yeah.
Sure, I think that Dalibor made a really good point that it's very hard to narrow down on one example of hybrid war because it's all working together in concert, right? I was thinking about, what kind of example is good to highlight in this scenario, but you just have to kind of list them out, right? Exactly as Dalibor kind of mentioned, these are becoming more and more scary. So Russian scrambling of GPS, for example, in the Baltic Sea region, which is causing civilian aircraft to be diverted. The barrage of cyber attacks in the Baltic states have also increased some 40%, I think, the Latvian service mentioned since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and these are often following decisions by the government in support of Ukraine. This year, the Estonian Security Service detained 13 individuals for desecrating national memorial sites. There's evidence of kind of young criminals being recruited to do some sort of sabotage work, throwing fire bombs, attempting to set fire to the Museum of Occupation in Latvia, for example. then of course there's just this constant sort of barrage of disinformation that is happening. In the Baltic countries this summer, there was significant misinformation that those in power were trying to drag the Baltic countries into war with Russia. They were trying to provoke nuclear escalation with Russia. And of course, this disinformation, I think we can talk about all of the examples of hybrid warfare that are happening in the Baltic region in particular, or in Eastern Europe more broadly, but also I think it's important to remember that part and parcel of this is Russian disinformation operations that are about perhaps the Baltics, but are also geared toward Western audiences, right? So the idea that or the efforts to depict the Baltic states as backward or oppressive or fascist, to exploit really complex histories, to undermine state legitimacy, not only within the populations within the Baltic states, but also with partners abroad, and therefore sort of undermine resolve to support the efforts at countering Russia more broadly.
Let's put this in perspective. Russia has had, in effect, unconstrained access to every level of European societies for the past 3 decades. The Chinese were in a similar situation. That's a separate conversation. It's not a subject of our discussion here. The point I'm trying to make is that over those 3 decades, the Russians have been going to school on the vulnerabilities of the West, on how to exploit our own value set, our own institutions, our own media against us. Rather than talking about hybrid threats, I prefer to talk about a continuum between non-kinetic at one end and kinetic at the other. And the Russians have been very adept at exploiting the levels of vulnerability, testing us in terms of when we will respond. And let me walk through what happened between 2008 and the present day. I would submit to you that was the lack of a decisive response from the West. When Putin crossed the line, when he used military power to redraw the map, when he occupied terrain, at every single turn, the response was muted, wanting, and then there was a return to some extent to business as usual. Every single time we did this, we increased the level of threat and the level of vulnerability. So that's the first point I would like to make. Today, we're in a situation where I would argue through these both non-kinetic and kinetic operations, Putin wants to fracture the NATO alliance politically. We are obsessed with vertical escalation to nuclear, and you can never dismiss this when you're dealing with a power like Russia that has nuclear weapons. So it's always there, but I would argue that relative to the threat of horizontal escalation of the war in Ukraine, creating a crisis into NATO, let's say a rocket flying into a NATO country, into a Baltic state, into Finland, into Warsaw, hitting a school, hitting a hospital, that's going to be a moment of decision for the alliance in terms of how we respond to this. So we are obsessing with vertical, and he's playing it out very, very well. In effect, he's creating a system through the information operations, through propaganda, through constant threats, to actually compel us to self-deter in this process. And so if we do not respond in a decisive way, it doesn't matter that we have capabilities that outmatch what the Russians have. If you look at the crisis after crisis after crisis, even when we use ordnance to defend our allies, as we did in Israel, we shoot at arrows. We don't shoot at archers. We don't allow the Ukrainians to reach deep into the sources of attacks. Let me give you one specific example and show you how pernicious Russian behavior can be. The question of asylum policy, migration, human rights, these are vital topics for any conversation in the European Union. Poland has been under assault, in effect, from Belarus with wave after wave of migrants. Most of them largely delivered, if you will, to Belarus through a network that has been established in place, sustained and supported by the Russian FSB and the Belarusian KGB. These men and women, some of them are trained, some of them are accidental, if you will, bystanders who have been recruited into this. And nonetheless, they're forcing the Polish government to deploy a large portion of their military, in effect, in a guard duty to keep the border from being overrun. What that means, Those thousands of Polish soldiers with reserves and rotations that are required are taken out of training. They're taken out of learning new equipment that Poland is buying. They're taken out, if you will, from the ledger of the balance of forces between NATO and Russia. This is just one example of why Russia is doing this, and I would argue it targets Poland specifically because that country today is what the Bon Republic was in the Cold War. It's the hub on the frontier connecting, actually, our regional defense plans, critical to the security of the Baltic states, to the security of our Scandinavian allies, and also to what's going to happen further down, especially in Romania. The Russians in the Black Sea are jamming GPS. They're running their vessels through exclusive zones where they're not supposed to be. And every single time they do that, deterrence continues to lag because they're getting away with it. I think this is the biggest threat we're facing right now when it comes to Russians pushing us in Europe, pushing us in Central Europe, the Baltics, and testing the limits of what they can get away with.
Thank you very much for these, for giving us these ideas of the various active measures that that Russia is pursuing in the region. I'll ask one more question and then open it up to questions from the audience. As mentioned, the Helsinki Commission recently published this report on contesting Russia. And one of the main conclusions is that the Russian threat isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Even if there was a regime change in Moscow tomorrow, we need to be prepared to contest Russia for the long term. As we've discussed, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have had remarkable resilience in the face of Russian aggression and imperialism. Can you give us, some examples of effective strategies or tactics that have been used in these countries to combat Russian hybrid warfare? And are there any lessons the United States can take from these approaches?
Should we take turns again? So I'm not sure if I'll sort of point you to specific examples, but I'd like to use this to kind of like frame the problem in a way that I think is really important. We want to establish deterrence against Russian gray zone warfare or active measures, if you will. The way you establish deterrence, as any sort of undergraduate student of international relations will tell you, is either by denial or by punishment. Clearly, countries such as Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia have established themselves as very effective in putting in place deterrence by denial. They've done it through active sort of whole of government measures, training of local mayors, preparedness, education, helping their societies understand trustworthy versus untrustworthy sources of information. I would say that Central and Eastern Europe at large is not a homogeneous, unambiguous success story, because there are countries that are far more vulnerable to Russian hybrid measures, disinformation, etc., than others. And if there is, and I'm sure Indra knows much more about this than I do, but if there is one common pattern, I think, to the success stories, is that it's much easier to me to sort of establish deterrence by denial in societies that are reasonably homogeneous, that have high levels of trust, that kind of understand that we are all in this together. So drawing lessons from, say, Finland and trying to transplant them into a sort of big federal, argumentative, rambling society like the United States might not really get you where we want to be. But an equally important part of the story, I think, is deterrence by punishment. And that's where we are much, much weaker. So basically, in our escalatory ladder, we have sanctions, then there is this big void, and then we have kinetic war and potentially nuclear war. And I think we have to get much more creative somewhere in that middle. I'm not saying we should be replicating Russian approaches. Like, ours is a society governed by the rule of law. We don't go abroad to assassinate people or set things on fire. But boy, could we maybe look for openings to keep Putin on his toes, and for him to sort of wake up in the morning wondering what it is that we might do, like whether some of his friends might find their assets frozen, in an offshore jurisdiction. If Israel can disrupt ATMs in Iran, maybe we should be also able to inflict pain, destabilize, embarrass the regime, flood Telegram channels with a bit of nonsense here and there. And we've just been sort of collectively unwilling or unable to sort of even think about that domain of warfare, and I think it is to our collective detriment.
Yeah, I think you have alluded a little bit to some of the examples from the Baltic states. The Baltic states have done, I think, a relatively good job at learning how to either respond quickly and effectively to Russian aggression or to preempt it and prepare themselves for areas of potential aggression on the front end. I think that Lithuania's approach to energy diversification, for example, is a good one here. They were 100% dependent on Russian natural gas. They recognizing this as a vulnerability, took early steps to diversify their supply already in 2014, and then, by April of 2022, they were able to fully shut off natural gas imports from Russia. So the Baltic states in general have been building their energy infrastructure that's allowing them to kind of more quickly pivot than they had anticipated necessarily and synchronize with Europe. Estonia is a good example. Of course, I think we're probably all familiar with the cyber attack of 2007, possibly the first of its kind. Took out banks, media institutions, government services, but also included these violent riots that were really stoked by misinformation and the weaponization of historical memory. And now we know of what is maybe the most common understanding of Estonia is e-Estonia, right? That they're at the forefront of cybersecurity, building not only the technological prowess, but also building resiliency within their populations, and doing so in public-private sort of cooperation. So I think a really interesting example from the Estonian Defense Forces is their cyber conscription, which recruits from secondary schools, but also information technology companies to build competencies that work both for the state's defense needs, cyber defense needs, but also in the private sector. And an example of I may from Latvia as well. Well, we know that Latvia has a large Russian-speaking population. Over a third of the population is Russian-speaking, and so whether they like it or not, they are often referred to as these compatriots. They fall under Russia's compatriot policy. I want to stress, though, of course, that the Russian-speaking population is quite diverse, and we can see in their also kind of diversity of support, a large support for the Ukrainians in the war with Russia. But Latvia has also, developed this sort of wealth of expertise, knowing that they're going to be the subject of frequent disinformation. The narratives there, again, are perhaps have a little. You can hear a little bit of an echo in our own situation in the United States. The narratives are directed at undermining trust in government, drawing on nostalgia, alleging mistreatment. And the response has been pretty multi-pronged. So it's a legislative action. Latvia was the first to prosecute successfully an individual with regard to spreading disinformation. There's also journalists and nonprofit organizations that are working to actively kind of help the public better understand media literacy. They're kind of, you might have heard of the elves fighting the trolls in Lithuania, and these institutions around debunking and pre-bunking these narratives. So, the Baltic states are working on kind of a variety of these different sort of practical terms. I think, the takeaways here also are some of those practical applications. So improving our cybersecurity, improving media literacy and the ability to discern what is good and what is bad information. And the U.S. also has a role to play here in supporting these efforts in the Baltic states, but also at home, and recognizing the kind of multi-layered approach that the Baltics, I think, are taking is also critical. So if we think talking again about hybrid attacks, they're coming in on multiple planes. So we have to think about cross-sectoral cooperation, public, private, military, and civil kind of responses.
So let me be very blunt. There is no greater imperative, in my view, for the European allies than simply to rearm at speed and scale. If there is anything that's going to deter Russia, it's real exercised military capabilities with appropriate air and missile defenses, system integration, finding a way to actually meld the different disparate digital infrastructures of 32 allies, and coming up with an unequivocal message that the new regional plans that NATO has can be implemented because the capabilities commitments that are required are there. Every time I'm in Europe, I preach this message to any audience that I have an opportunity to speak to. And again, this is not about percentages of GDP. Although countries along the flank are leading the way, Poland is now advocating 4%, the Baltics are stepping up, the Scandinavians. It's about what you spend that money on. If 80% of your budget goes on personnel, retirement, and other costs, and you're not really producing the real capabilities that the SACEUR can plug into his operational planning, that money, you could go to 10% of your GDP. It's the structure of what you spend on. That's the first thing. The second thing is we're paying the price for the fact that we didn't respond appropriately already in 2008, not to mention 2014. Every time he used military power, he scored a geopolitical win. I'm talking about Putin, and paid only a marginal price for that. He invades Georgia. Nord Stream 1 is completed. He invades the Syrians. He is a big player, now in the Middle East. He takes Crimea. Nord Stream is still initiated as another project. The message that was given to Russians is that the West has no willpower, and the energy dependence, his ability to manipulate the political elites to influence public debate, will allow him to get to where he needs to be. That's why I think 2022 is such an important year for us, because all of a sudden, for the first time, we stood up. We responded from the strategic gut, so to speak, and NATO is politically unified. What worries me when it comes to Ukraine and deterrence and defense is that political unity is slightly thinner than I would have wanted it to be, because when it comes to appetite for risk-taking, it depends on where you sit on the map. So when I'm in Tallinn, Helsinki, or Vilnius, or Warsaw, or Bucharest, it's Russia, Russia, Russia. They get it. I was recently in Stockholm. Same thing with the Swedes, same thing with the Norwegians. When I start moving away geographically from the flank, from the frontier, things begin to change. Germany is now no longer a frontier country. France is preoccupied with the Mediterranean. So in Paris, I hear, European southern borders now in the Sahel, it's in the Med. We need to be paying attention over there. And I sometimes joke that when I get to Portugal, I have no idea what we're talking about other than migration issues and economic development. Jokes aside, my point is the following. We need to get to a unified threat perception across the alliance, because only that will trigger genuine commitment to invest in necessary military reconstitutions. And here's the bad news. The war in Ukraine has been going on for 3 years now, okay? The Russians are now on track and at least trying to field a 1.5 million military. The Chinese People's Liberation Army is about 2 million. If you look at the sizes of European militaries outside of the flank, if you look at the stocks of munitions, they're virtually non-existent. If you look at the number of operational tanks, which are very, very few, and compare that to the level of Russian force reconstitution and how much armor they're putting back into service, relying on old stocks, some of the new production, this is going to look very, very dangerous for us. Secondly, the Russians, remember, we have 1,800 miles of NATO's border now to defend. Finland itself is 830 miles. Okay? We have no infrastructure, north-south, that is adequate to the task of military mobility across the theater. We need to invest in that. And yet, at the political level, the military side is on track. Our military gets it. They have developed the regional plans. They have capabilities, commitments attached to them. They're working on force integration and the rest of it. What's missing is political will to speak to the public in Europe and, frankly, here in the United States as well, to say how dangerous the situation is becoming. We have an ongoing war in Ukraine. We now also have a war in the Middle East. In effect, the front of confrontation with the axes of dictatorships is expanding. We may have instability on the Korean Peninsula, and then, of course, the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the size of the European militaries, they're inadequate to the task with very few exceptions. And let me say a few words about the flank. Small nations like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, especially Finland, are doing their part. Finland is 5.5 million people. They can field an army of 280,000 at a drop of a hat. They have the largest conventional artillery. They have resilience programming built into their total defense concept. This is where the rest of the alliance needs to go. And frankly, the same goes for our own military. We're spending now roughly 3.1% of our GDP on defense. That's roughly half of what we spent during the Cold War. Our joint force is probably in NDA at about 1.3 million. It was never less than 2 million during the Cold War, roughly speaking. And if you looked at the defense spending, so we are playing catch up, and I think in large part because the 3 decades of the peace dividend were so good. And it's very hard to let go and recognize the realities on the ground, but I think it's way past time to do that.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes, please. Oh, we have a mic coming.
Greetings, I'm Carl Hickey. I'm from the Joint Baltic American National Committee. We are all aware that the Baltic states have a very strong attitude in regards to Russia. However, Western European states and the United States doesn't have this attitude. How do you suggest that Baltic states and individuals here in the United States can push for our elite to adopt the necessary mindset to combat Russia?
Yeah, you know, I read in the there's a piece published in the Kyiv Independent yesterday that was talking exactly about this. The main takeaway is that Europeans are starting to listen better to the Baltic states, but Washington is not. I don't know that I know the answer to how we make our allies listen a little bit better. I mean, I think that this kind of a forum is important. I think that the Baltic political leadership is really doing a lot of work in this field. I mean, I think that they are trying from the position that they are able to. I remember, you know, when the war began when the invasion, after the invasion, there was rarely a day that you could open up the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian and not see an interview with, you know, Kaja Kallas or Edgar Sienkiewicz or Gabrielis Landsbergis. You know, I think that there's a concerted effort and an understanding in Baltic political leadership that they have to be as loud as they can, and as loud as they can in as many forums as they can, so in expert forums, in public forums. I think that there's a recognition that it would be really hard, you know, to convince Americans that the Baltic states are worth defending if they have no idea where the Baltic states are or what they, you know, what they do, right? So, or that they are our allies and have been for decades, right? So, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that you're pointing to a considerable and important issue that still remains.
Yeah, please.
Just add 2 cents to it. Probably not in the sort of most constructive manner, but there was a time when I was reasonably hopeful that the message has started sinking in. If you remember President Macron's visit to Bratislava, Slovakia in 2022, his speech in which he said, we should have listened, you were right, we were wrong. but I think people are sort of keen to kind of forget the lesson and move on. And I have one little anecdote from my trip to Italy last week, which suggests that actually the message is not sinking in. So Prime Minister Meloni, I think she's been terrific on Ukraine, and deserves all the credit. But when you look at whether it's her party or the Italian political class at large, I think the sort of commitment to Ukraine goes an inch deep. I was in a conversation with senior Italian officials, one legislator, one former diplomat. Doesn't really matter who they were or what their affiliations were, but the common themes coming from their side of the table was that Russia was entitled to a buffer zone, that we mistreated Russia, neglected Russian concerns. And one of the guys then turned to me after the conversation in a very sort of paternalistic, sort of friendly way, trying to sort of lecture me on how I shouldn't be sort of invoking these Balts and Poles because, when I was a diplomat, I worked with them. They are insufferable. They were so pushy, so aggressive. We can work with the French and the Germans, but those Eastern Europeans, they really did not master the art of diplomacy the way great nations such as Russia did. And so as long as this mindset is still present, and I suspect that it is more present than not in places like Paris and Rome and Berlin, I think it will be very hard to make collective progress in Europe. So on that somewhat pessimistic note.
So I have just one comment. To quote the great philosopher, the meaning of life is to show up. You need to work with countries in the region. If you look at the size of the Baltic states in terms of population and economic base and the rest of it, and I say this as a great friend of the Baltic countries, but you're city-states, you're very small in terms of the population base, okay? But if you start working on a regional basis, aligning with Finland, with Poland, with the Scandinavian countries, then your voice will be heard that much more. That's number one. Number two, what Dalibor said is very true. It's easy to dismiss countries that were once within the Soviet Empire, somehow Russophobes and irrational and too emotional. Well, work with the Finns. The Finns understand the Russians. They're probably the toughest nation when it comes on opposing Russia that you can find out there. I can tell you a proverb that a Finnish soldier taught me. He said, my grandmother said to me, you can fry a Russian in butter, but he's still a Russian, tastes the same. That tells you how tough they are. And at the same time, in this town, the Finns are not perceived in any shape or form in a similar way as the countries that were once occupied. So develop a regional strategy, number one. Glue yourself at the hip to the countries like Poland, like Finland, like Sweden. Operate jointly, number two. Number three, make sure that the American public, the congressional leadership, knows what you're doing. Because I hear how important the relationship between the Baltics and the United States is. Most of the time I hear this in Vilnius, Tallinn, and Riga. You need to deliver this message here, that you're spending the money, that you're building the real capabilities. With Finland and Sweden and NATO, the center of gravity of the alliance has shifted to the northeastern corridor. It's critical both for our plans and for our ability to deter and defend. At the same time, there are only 3 countries on the flank that have population resources large enough to build large conventional armies. That's Poland, Romania, and Ukraine. Ukraine is the best NATO ally that is not in NATO, that NATO never had. But you can bring so much to it, and now with Finland and Sweden in it, you have the geostrategic depth to actually be defensible and make a difference. So stay on the message, show yourself up here, reach out, write about it, talk about it, show up.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Carl.
Yes. Hi. On behalf of my Baltic colleagues and the 2 other Estonians, including myself, who are in the audience today, I'd like the 3 of you, and appreciate you all being here, and thank you for all the well wishes with the Estonian Embassy. Would like you to delve deeper into things you all 3 alluded to, the escalation ladder, where the Baltics are and NATO is operating under the idea that in 2 to 4 years, Russia will have reconstituted its military capabilities behind the Baltic porters, Russian military reforms, and all this stuff. That doesn't mean that in 2 to 4 years there will be a kinetic onslaught incoming, though it may. In talks with our military leadership and such, I've heard that we rather expect it to be an attack, a probing attack, probably intended to fragment NATO, more along the lines of what you've been talking about in terms of hybrid threats. It could be a swarm of drones smuggled into one of the Baltic countries and let loose to target our army bases, for example. What measures would you, or twofold question, if you were Putin, what would you do to really go after? So we would be better prepared, I guess, with that purpose, Oscar. If you were Putin, what do you think would be, what might he do that would really bring a moment of decision to NATO, such as the example I just brought, that this is either Arctic or FAB or it isn't, but also, well, I guess that's good enough. Sorry for rambling, thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Who would like to take that?
Let me start, okay? I'll be the last one to be advising Putin what to do. I don't want to make his job any easier, but jokes aside. Look, there's a temporal dimension to war. You're absolutely right. The Russians are reconstituting their forces much faster than many analysts anticipated. Remember, the Russian Air Force and the Navy are barely touched. It's mainly the land forces that have been mauled by the Ukraine, so it's one thing. He's going into old stocks, pulling out T-72s, even T-62s. He's got some small percentage of new tank production. At the rates that he is going, and the estimates that were in the public domain last year were between 13 and 1,500 tanks per year that the Russians were putting back into service. Ask yourself how many tanks are in the British Army, how many tanks are in the Bundeswehr, how many tanks. Poland sent tons of armor, and equipment to Ukraine. Everybody's trying to buy new equipment, but the defense industrial base in the United States and in Europe cannot sustain that pace of orders in terms of contracts. So we will be living in the next 2-3 years in a very fluid and a very dangerous situation. Because if this is his rate of reconstitution, and he wants to fight a dumb fight, he wants to come close and force NATO to play on his rules. Look at the Baltic states. How far is it to Vilnius from the Belarusian border? 20 miles? How far is it to Warsaw from the border? Less than 200 kilometers? What if he has this armor there, starts driving it? There are no stocks of munitions. Every tank takes a javelin, a round, or whatever you need to do. And he clearly demonstrated, I'm speaking of Putin again, that he doesn't care about the life of his people and his crews. And so what happens if we get into this situation? And what I fear the most is, as I said at the very beginning, the Atlantic and the Pacific are not an either-or proposition. They're part of the same problem set. They're interconnected theaters. And if you look at the size of the U.S. military, if we have crises expanding, right? Remember what happened after Hamas attacked Israel. Ukraine disappeared in this town from the headlines. All the oxygen went into that theater. If there is another crisis, I would submit to you that Putin will be waiting for the other members of this axis of dictatorship to stir up trouble, expand the theater, and put pressure on us. So what can you do? Again, this is no rocket science. Rearm, push allies in NATO to spend the money. I find it to be unacceptable that a continent as wealthy as Europe is, 500 million people, cannot raise conventional capability to contain what is basically a shadow of the Soviet Union. Russia is at 140 million people today. Compare this to the Soviet Union that was sitting in the middle of Germany, had 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions, at a snap of a finger, China was not really a player in this game. And you're telling me that Europe is not able to generate within NATO, I emphasize. I think the ideas for strategic autonomy and all of that are really, really counterproductive. Resource the regional plans in NATO. You should be able to do it. So you as Baltic states, every time you talk to a leader in a major European capital, especially of larger states, tell them, you need to rearm. You need to spend the money. There's no free lunch. That is a problem. And again, democracies move very slowly. and governments move when public opinion moves. And we're in a, I once made a joke that fat times tend to produce managers, not leaders. And unfortunately, Europe's been rolling in butter for 30 years, quite frankly. And I'm being blunt here. But I also know that in a crisis, democracies are unbeatable. Democracies then rise up to occasion. So my money is on democracies, not on Mr. Putin. But we're in a very dangerous situation right now.
Dalibor?
Happy to add two things. First, on military capabilities. There's this divergence in threat perceptions. Of course, there's also, there are great differences in productive capabilities and sort of the size of the defense industrial base across Europe. And unfortunately, it's the countries that actually could be stepping up and could be, getting stuff on the market that feel the most complacent or feel kind of constrained by fiscal considerations. There was a really disturbing paper that came out of the Kiel Institute back in September. That's the organization that tracks, among other things, assistance to Ukraine. But they sort of looked at the effects of Zeitenwende on German military capabilities and made the observation that while Russians can shoot around 100,000 rounds of ammunition, that is both rockets and artillery shells a day, and kind of maintain this as that's a sort of sustainable rate for the Russians. If Bundeswehr tried to do the same thing in a kinetic war, they would run out of artillery shells within 70 days. And so that's after much of that 100 billion of Zeitenwende money has already been sort of spent and allocated, and contracts have been signed. And so they also look at the rate at which the German defense forces are rebuilding themselves because of this additional money, and they take 2004 as a benchmark and conclude that if things continue on the current trajectory and Germany would sort of keep on buying the stuff that it is buying and adding to the stocks, it will take something like 20 years to get back to 2004 levels of fighter jets, 40 years to get back to the 2004 levels of the number of tanks that they had, and a century to get back to the 2004 levels of howitzers that they had. So clearly, this is not good enough, and that even sets aside the question of what happens once this money is spent and Germany sort of goes back below 2%, as it seems likely in terms of defense spending. To the question itself, I don't want to offer advice to Putin, not that he would need my advice, but I think we set a really dangerous precedent in Ukraine when we were hearing from the administration that it was an utmost priority to keep the war contained to Ukraine, because that in a different context would really run contrary to the idea of collective defense, where a conflict that happens in Estonia should not be contained to Estonia if we are going to act if NATO is going to act as a collective body. So if I were to make an educated guess on what Putin might try to do, it is to try to establish a new geopolitical reality on the ground in one of these frontline states, which can be done, I suppose, very quickly, relatively easily. And while doing that, try to split the alliance on what is to happen next, because NATO is not, Article 5 is not a sort of automatic trigger that just gets pulled whenever something happens on the ground. It does require deliberation, it does require consensus. And I think the idea is to split the alliance, establish a foothold, and basically declare NATO vacuous. And I think we have to do our utmost to prevent that.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of additional words. I think yes, rearmament is critical, and but I won't go into what has already been spoken about, except for this relates exactly to the point that the previous questioner brought up: is how do we make the argument outside of the Baltic states, outside of the frontline states, that those states are worth defending, and how do we make those arguments in the capitals, with decision makers, but also with the people who have to support or who have to at least have some impact with their elected representatives. I mean, that I think is the critical question for the Baltic states as well, is that this needs the importance of defending Baltic territory from the first inch, defending NATO territory from the first yard, has to resonate beyond, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, beyond Poland, beyond the Eastern European states. So I think in addition to these military steps and measures, we have to think also about that information campaign that the Baltic states are engaged in as well.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hello. My name is Oscar Buvalic. I'm from the Slovak Embassy. This might be more remarks and a follow-up rather than a question, but please, I will encourage you to follow up. So I spent 4 years in Berlin. At the time I was there, the defense minister was Ursula von der Leyen. Well, she went over to the EU, and the German military didn't do any huge leaps under her tenure. The current NATO Secretary General isn't called Kaczynski or Iohannis or Niinisto. He's called Rutte. So, yeah, you might be right. It's about politics.
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. I think you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're making a comment that political leadership that you saw in Europe before that, before the crisis in Ukraine, before the war started, these are still people who are there, right, who are calling the shots. That's true, but also the environment in which we all operate has changed dramatically. I think the flank countries should appreciate the role that they've played. You could not have supplied Ukraine without Poland, without the J-Town base in Rzeszów and all the transit and logistics. What also became, I think, very clear to the Europeans that they urgently needed the United States in Europe for their own security and defense. Nobody could have executed this logistical operation but the Americans in terms of the capabilities. Not so much hope, I sincerely believe that the events on the ground will force the Europeans to revisit the question of defense industrial base, munition production, armament production. Frankly, the same applies to us. I mean, we lived for 3 decades with the just-in-time delivery system mindset, because the wars that we fought, we knew when those wars would start. We could plan for the logistics that we'd use. Our logistical supply chains were not threatened. We're in a completely different environment. In Washington, in Berlin, in Warsaw, in London, in Paris, we need to move to just-in-case mindset, stockpiling, redundancies in the system, threatened logistics. And again, this will require considerable leadership in Europe and in the United States to articulate to the public. I have a running argument with a number of colleagues who tell me, well, the American public will not support higher defense spending than what we currently do. And my answer is, has anybody asked? Has anybody made the case, presented the reality of the situation on the ground? And if we don't do that, sure, who wants to spend money on things other than social programs and things that benefit you? It's not really, I guess, an answer to you per se, but also a comment from my end. I think this crisis has now deepened to a point that we will see pressure build up for some action. The question is time, because, the Finns are buying the F-35s, the Poles are buying the F-35s, the Romanians are buying the F-35s. Well, how many can we produce a year to actually deliver at speed and scale? That's the question for the US side. We need to invest in our own defense industrial base and expand. And the larger question is, what the Russians have shown in Ukraine is that mass still matters. We've lived in this world of thinking in high-tech terms, precisions, unmanned systems and all of that. And in fact, yeah, this is important, but in the final analysis, if you don't have the mass, if you don't have the capability, the brigades, the tanks, the ammunition, Your precision weapons will only take you so far. So my comment, not really an answer.
Thank you.
So if you read what I've written, I mean, Rutte is a very accomplished politician and full respect for what he's done. But the message, in my view, and I wrote about this, of selecting somebody from the flank would be the right message to send to the Russians at that time. Yeah.
If I can just expand a little bit on your question, which I think is, about political leadership, just to the rest of our panelists, do you see the center of gravity shifting east, in these European institutions? And, how can we better leverage the expertise of, our Central and Eastern European colleagues on the eastern flank?
Don't want to repeat myself too much, but I just still don't see the message sinking in enough in key Western European capitals. I think it's laudable that the French president acknowledged that Eastern Europeans had been right. It is a sign of progress that there is a commissioner and no other than Andrius Kubilius in charge of building up some form of European defense industrial base. But if you sort of look at the budget he'll be operating with, and we are still sort of talking about very, very modest amounts and sort of baby steps at the time when much more is needed. But I don't think there is a sort of easy way out other than, events. Events do shape politics, and the world is getting progressively more dangerous, and I think the sort of what awaits us will not be linear. I think we'll be sort of confronted with crises and a sort of turmoil that will force change. I just hope it's not too late.
Thank you.
To put maybe a slightly more optimistic spin, I think that it is important that we are seeing people like Kaja Kallas, assume the role of chief diplomat of the European Union, and Andrius Kubilius, former Lithuanian PM, is the first leader of the defense and space portfolio. So I think that there, in some ways, also is starting. We're having this acknowledgement that these frontline countries have expertise and deserve to be at the kind of the big boys' table, if you will, right? I think that the Baltic states, for example, right, are also doing as much as they can by leading by example, right? They're really putting their money where their mouth is in terms of their support for Ukraine. So it's difficult to fault them, right? Like they are the biggest contributors to Ukraine with Denmark. They are consistently making the case for Ukraine's path to membership in the EU and NATO. And as Andrew mentioned, it is more effective because they are working together with their other partners. So it's not, this Latvian delegation can say whatever it wants, but it's only useful if they are working together with partners. And the Baltic states are a little bit notorious for not being always so great at working together, except for when it kind of matters. So working and with their allies in Poland, in Finland, making the Nordic Baltic 8 a bigger kind of influence in these international institutions, I think is really important. And I think that Kaja Kallas talked about this in a way that perhaps is important to amplify. When you sit in Kyiv, she said, it's the same distance to Tallinn as it is to Berlin, more or less. So, we have to kind of help to reposition our thinking that this is not something so far away, really, from the centers of power, right? But really, almost in some ways, just as close as it is to the Baltic states.
So I think...
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make one comment about regional cooperation. It's not just about politics. It's just about bringing the capabilities together. So the Scandinavians will bring 250 fourth-generation aircraft to the table. The Finnish F-35s, the Polish F-35s, the Romanian ones. So when I say that Poland is buying 250 V-3 Abrams, this is the most capable tank out there in the world right now. So the very fact that this will be a formidable force that those states will bring to the table in and of itself will be a huge asset in the political conversations that takes place. So when I say the center of gravity is shifting northeast into this corridor, it's not just because of the politics of it or NATO enlargement and the longer border. It's the real capabilities that these countries will bring.
Thank you. So we're getting low on time, but we'll do one last round here and take two. I think I saw two questions, so we'll take both of them. Starting with Paul.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Paul Massaro, Staff Director of the Helsinki Commission. Dr. Rohach, Dr. Micha. These are terrific interventions. I couldn't agree more with what you said earlier about where we need to get. I also couldn't agree more that it hasn't really sunk in, and I sort of feel like it's hard for me to see where we are after almost 3 years of war, how little it's sunk in, and particularly in a number of different countries that should sort of know better. This seems like we barely averted disaster, and all thanks to the Ukrainians. If Russia had been successful, if Zelensky had left Ukraine, Poland would now have a giant border with Russia, effectively. The Russians would have 40 million new slaves to mobilize into their essentially conscript army to throw at Poland or the Baltics or Romania, and that was the goal. It's very extraordinary thinking back how they even posted the op-eds they were going to publish the next day after the successful decapitation of Kyiv, how the American-led world order had been destroyed and this is a new age and all that kind of stuff. And, for the first couple of weeks it did, there was a feeling of, at least for me, this is something new. Like, we are finally going to move into a new paradigm. Scholz immediately gave the very famous Zeitenwende speech. And it's really hard for me 3 years later to think that really any of this has come to fruition. There are certainly things with Poland and Finland. Again, I think that the states being presented today, are countries that took this seriously, have taken it seriously, and have. But I also can't help but feel sort of a sense of dismay that there hasn't been more of an evolution on the side of people that should really know better. And I guess I wonder what it's going to take. If it's not going to take a brush with death, essentially the end, what would have been the end of everything as we know it, what is it going to take to finally get us serious on this? Is there another question?
Thanks, Paul. And I think there's one question behind you.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your insights. I come from the Western Balkans, so I couldn't help but notice the absence of Western Balkans in the conversation. We've seen that Russia's diplomacy has turned into blackmail diplomacy, especially when it comes to the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Russian ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina stated that if Bosnia and Herzegovina decides to continue pursuing NATO membership, then Russia has a right to defend itself. This is despite the fact that Bosnia and Herzegovina is not a neighboring country, it does not have a significant Russian-speaking population, and it's not a former part of the Soviet Union. So given these circumstances and the fact that Western Balkan countries are not frequently seen as frontline states, where do you see the opportunities for engagement with the countries of the Western Balkans, especially in its relation to Central and Eastern Europe? So.
Yeah, whoever wants to respond to that first, please.
So to your question first. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. You know the cliche, right? Listen to our debate on national security strategy. It's all normative. It's all defensive. We're defending the rules-based international order. We're on our heels. We're arguing in a way that does not articulate a vision of what the post-war order is supposed to be. Russia can't win, Ukraine can't lose. What does that really mean? How do you build operational planning around this? So the first point I would make is, I think the biggest shortcoming, because my money is on the West, if you combine our economies, if you combine our population resources, our technology, shouldn't even be a conversation, right? Is the absence of a strategic vision that actually outlines the ends. What does victory look like? I hear strategic competition all the time, great power competition, strategic. What does the win look like? What is the geostrategic map that you want to get to? What are the end states, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Balkans? What are the end states in Russia itself? What is it that we would consider to be the end result we want to work for and spend money on and move in that direction? And I don't hear that conversation yet. So I share your dismay, because I remember when the Zeiten, I was still posted in Germany when the Zeitenwende speech was delivered by Chancellor Scholz, and everybody was talking about the great change and the rest of it. Frankly, I like less Zeit and more Wende today when it comes to the decisions that are being made. And I'm not just singling out Germany. I'm just saying most of the political class still lives in this crisis of disbelief, that somehow things were so fat, so good, so wonderful. Maybe we can patch it up, figure it out, do something. So yeah, that's a huge disappointment. I think what we need is a strategy that American citizenry will understand. That if you go to a farmer in Iowa and you say, pay your taxes because X, Y, Z, it's not because you're defending the rules-based international order, because that's abstract, that's normative. Why is it important for our prosperity? Why is it important for Homeland Security that we should build this military capability? Why are alliances force multipliers for us? Why do we stay, engaged in Europe? Why the loss in the Atlantic means that we will eventually lose in the Pacific? Why are these problem sets interrelated? And for that, it takes leadership to articulate this. On the Balkans, ma'am, it's a tough one, because it's a very difficult neighborhood right now. The Russians and the Chinese have been running all over in different shape or form. And it's very difficult now to generate any sort of sense, of a shared future, or at least some sort of a coherent policy. And because the Ukrainian problem set is so huge, we don't have the attention span we once had, I would argue. And that applies both to Western Europe, Central Europe, and the United States and its allies in this hemisphere. Will it change? I fervently hope so, but I'm not very optimistic that you will see a sudden evolution of policy in that direction.
Indra?
Yeah, I think, to your question, Paul, it seems that the West is still stuck in this conception that I think both of my co-panelists have referred to, that, if only we can pull Russia into this sort of Western mind frame that economic growth, or something like this is going to lead to some sort of remarkable, blooming democracy in Russia, we're still kind of stuck in this mindset, right? It hasn't, and neither has the dissolution of the Soviet Union sort of diminished Russia's understanding of itself as an empire. So I think it's also important for us to listen to the people who are closest to it, who say that, to remind us that also this all doesn't go away the day that Vladimir Putin, drops dead, right? This is not only in Russian leadership, but it is also part and parcel of Russian society in the way that it conceives of itself. It's also, importantly, worryingly, part of the Russian opposition as well. So the idea that the West also risks sort of infantilizing Russian society, as kind of as people without agency of their own, right, is also a problem that we have to think of today as well, right? This doesn't all change with leadership change. How are we going to get ahead of that as well? I won't even pretend to give an answer on the Balkans question, but it is disappointing. It is remarkable that with all that we know and all of the resources that we have and all the insight that our allies are telling us, that we haven't been able to make and affect change. This drip, drip, drip of aid is, it's the 1,000 paper cuts sort of a situation. Not very optimistic.
I mean, I'm happy to co-sign everything that Andrew and Indra put to you, and maybe just add a couple of very, very quick thoughts. It strikes me that part of the problem is indeed thinking in abstract categories instead of having a sort of strategic understanding of geography and interests. And like weirdly enough, Trump, with all his flaws, had sort of intuitive understanding of sort of power and power relations that kind of like rubbed many foreign policy professionals the wrong way, but had a sort of insight that I think was very often lacking. I mean, when you look at, say, the European Union's response to China's Belt and Road, the Global Gateway, which again talks about connectivity and talks in these sort of abstract categories without really having any sense of geographic focus, priorities, resources allocated, achievable sort of goals, countries that we want to engage with, countries that are kind of out of region. And I think that really makes sort of proactive sort of decision-making very, very difficult. I hosted yesterday a panel at AEI on Georgia and on the upcoming Georgian election. And one of the speakers was Chairman Turner from the Intelligence Committee. And what he said that sort of still keeps sort of nagging at me is that Russia right now is pretty busy with what's happening in Ukraine. And Georgia is a small country like Moldova, perhaps like many countries of the Western Balkans. Like, shouldn't we be trying to do something proactively in these places? Like some of this should be fairly low-hanging fruit. I mean, I would think of the Western Balkans, by virtue of their geography, like they're not, neighboring Russia. They're kind of like encapsulated by EU and NATO members in this little pocket. Like that should not be that difficult. Yet, in mid-noughties, the European Union basically decided to sort of put the region on autopilot, made these sort of commitments to eventual membership without really any intention of kind of delivering through political leadership. And then everybody was sort of surprised by the end of the previous decade that sort of autopilot did not really deliver the results we were hoping for. And I think, from Georgia through Moldova to Western Balkans, I think, people say, we don't have infinite bandwidth to do all this stuff, but especially a global superpower, should be able to do more than one thing at once. And I think that sort of applies to this idea that we have to just focus on competition with China to the detriment of everything else. But I think it also applies in a sort of more regional context, that we should be obviously helping Ukraine win this war, but we should, simultaneously be able to, allocate fairly modest resources to actually make, progress in these other places. And whether it's the EU or the United States, I don't think we are doing, a good enough job at that.
I will also just add that we expect to do an event on the Balkans soon, and we have a chapter in our report also dedicated to the Western Balkans. So stay tuned for more from the Commission. I just want to thank our incredible panelists for some really great insights today. What an incredible discussion. And thank you to the audience for participating and for some great questions. That concludes the briefing.